Welcome to Fort William, located on the rugged and rainy west coast of Scotland, on the shores of the mighty Loch Linnhe, and in the shadow of the tallest mountain in the UK, Ben Nevis. Mountaineers from all over the country flock to Fort William throughout the year to scale Ben Nevis, which towers far above the grey clouds in the sky on this morning. But there's much more to discover in Fort William than its famous neighbouring peak. We start our walk on the outskirts of the town centre, where we're looking at the walls of the old fort from which Fort William takes its name. Now, the remains of the fort that we see today date from the last decade of the 17th century, when England, Scotland and Ireland came under the rule of King William III, or William of Orange, after whom this fort was named. But the history of the fort here goes back just a little further than that, to the period known as the Protectorate, when Oliver Cromwell ruled the Three Kingdoms after his victory in the Civil War over King Charles I. But during that time, this region of Scotland became a hotbed of anti-Cromwellian sentiment, led at the forefront by the local clan, Clan Cameron, who had fought on the side of the king during the Civil War at the nearby Battle of Inverlochy in 1645. Meanwhile, in 1653, after Oliver Cromwell had taken power, Clan Cameron led an uprising in the Scottish Highlands against him, known as Glencairn's Rising. Unfortunately for Clan Cameron, Cromwell's forces crushed their rebellion, and the following year, Cromwell ordered the building of a wooden fort here to maintain a military garrison that would keep tabs on the region. Now, that wooden fort of the 1650s, built here overlooking the spectacular Loch Linnhe, was the starting point for a small civilian community that began to develop outside its walls. But as for the stone fort whose remains we're walking among today, that came a few decades later, in the aftermath of the so-called Glorious Revolution of the 1680s. Cromwell's Republican Protectorate crumbled soon after his death, and by 1660, Britain's monarchy had been restored, with King Charles II on the throne. But his brother and successor, James II, proved an unpopular monarch in England, and he was eventually peacefully deposed in 1689 after the arrival of William of Orange, who was invited to the country by a group of English noblemen. But despite the widespread popularity of William's arrival in England, much of Scotland resented this takeover, and soon a wave of Jacobite fervour in support of the deposed King James came to sweep across the country. Clan Cameron, highly influential in this part of the country, sided with the Jacobites, and therefore, just as Oliver Cromwell had feared, the new King William also sought to keep tabs on this region by maintaining a large military presence, which he managed by the construction of this strong stone fort, named Fort William. Now, here inside the fort, we're passing another important point in the modern town of Fort William, a large sign that marks the start and end of the Great Glen Way, a legendary long-distance walking route. The route follows the Great Glen, an ancient geological fault line that stretches right across northern Scotland, with the path beside it running for 62 miles from right here all the way to the city of Inverness. A hike along the Great Glen is one of the best ways to experience this rugged Highland landscape, and it passes between towering mountains and follows the shorelines of the mighty Loch Linnhe, Loch Linnhe and Loch Ness. But where exactly does the town of Fort William here fit into this spectacular part of the world? Well, as you can see from this map, Fort William lies right in the heart of Scotland's isolated and craggy west coast, although surprisingly, we're little more than 70 miles northwest of the city of Glasgow as the crow flies. With enormous mountains, vast lochs, and as you may have noticed from the sky above, a rather rugged climate, this region of Scotland is famously sparsely populated, and Fort William, with its population of just over 10,000, is actually the second biggest settlement in the Highlands, after Inverness. Of course, as we walk through this supermarket car park to get to the heart of the modern town, that isolation is part of the allure of the wild Highlands, particularly for mountaineers. The hill that we can see up in front of us isn't Ben Nevis, which is many, many times taller, but rather the relatively minute Cow Hill, which you can walk up to from the town centre if you fancy taking in some incredible views of the surrounding landscape, from Loch Linnhe to Ben Nevis itself. But if you want to come to Fort William to experience the Highlands for yourself, how exactly do you get here? Well, happily, Fort William is one of the few West Highland towns with its own train station, which we can see in front of us. The terminus of the West Highland Line, which runs from Glasgow, trains to Fort William from Glasgow take about 4 hours, but they pass through some absolutely staggering mountain scenery along the way. But as well as serving trains from Glasgow, this station, which opened in 1975, is also a terminus for the Caledonian Sleeper, which runs to and from London. That train ride is quite a bit longer, lasting around 12 hours, making it almost the longest train journey in the UK, the longest being the route between Aberdeen and Penzance in Cornwall, which takes over 13.5 hours. Now from the train station, we have to walk through a short tunnel to access the centre of Fort William, which is slightly disconnected from the fort that gave it its name. But as we just walked into the tunnel there, you might have noticed that the sign read Fáilte an Garastan, Gaelic for Welcome to Fort William. Apologies for my pronunciation there, but the town's name in Gaelic, An Garastan, literally means the garrison, and so it also refers to the fort around which the town grew. But in the past, the town's English name has occasionally been the subject of controversy, with some calling for Fort William to be dropped, arguing that the name is a reminder of English oppression over Scotland, and that changing the name to Angarastan would help to bolster the presence of Gaelic in the area. On the other side of the debate, the name Fort William is preferred by many others, but this town has actually had various different names over its centuries of history. As we pass by a lonely cable car pod in the centre of town, what we now know as Fort William has in the past been called Maryburgh, Gordonsborough, and Duncansburgh. But hang on a second, what was with that cable car? Well, it's there to promote the only mountain gondola in Scotland, which travels halfway up the nearby peak of Aonach, located just beside Ben Nevis, and also one of the highest summits in Britain. Now all of those summits are located above the clouds, and behind the building before us, Duncansburgh MacIntosh Church, which opened in 1882, and which takes its name from Sir Duncan Cameron, a former major contributor to this town. But out in front of the church, there also stands a majestic statue of one Donald Cameron, who fought with the Jacobites in the famous uprising of 1745, when he was the leader of Clan Cameron. Donald Cameron's influence and involvement in the Jacobite uprising helped to strengthen it greatly, giving its cause widespread support across this part of Scotland, and Clan Cameron would go on to fight on the front line for the Jacobites against the British government, until the uprising fell at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. Here, meanwhile, we find Fort William and District War Memorial, which stands in tribute to the locals who have fallen in conflict over the years. As I'm sure you've noticed, Fort William is a town with a long history of war and conflict, but there's more to it than that. For instance, the church at the centre of town brings us back to one of the many former names of Fort William, Duncansburgh. As we mentioned, Sir Duncan Cameron was a major contributor to this town in the 19th century, and he sought to have Fort William named after him. In the middle of that century, what was previously Gordonsborough briefly became Duncansburgh, and while the town was eventually renamed as Fort William a few years later, Duncansburgh remained the name of the local parish of which this church is a part. At the foot of the church, meanwhile, we find a memorial dedicated to the Boys' Brigade, which was founded in Glasgow in 1883, and many of whose members went on to serve in the 2 World Wars. But as we look up at the church, we'll soon see that these town gardens, otherwise known as the Parade, are full of war memorials, the town named after a fort certainly remaining in tune with its long military heritage. However, it's not only British military history that you'll find commemorated here in Fort William, as we'll see from a small memorial located in the corner of the Parade. The Parade as a whole is a delightful area of town to take a stroll around or sit down in, but taking a closer look at its many memorials can tell you of some fascinating stories from the past. Here in the corner of the town gardens, there stands the Fort William Peace Memorial, unveiled in partnership with the Japanese city of Hiroshima. This memorial was unveiled in 1985, and it marks the unlikely friendship of three towns in striving for peace: Hiroshima, Fort William, and the English town of Dudley. As random as that trio may seem, there's an inspiring story between their unlikely partnership for peace. On the 15th of August 1945, just 9 days after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, the Second World War came to a close. And on that same day, a mountaineer and peace campaigner by the name of Bert Bissell, who came from Dudley in England's West Midlands, arrived here in Fort William to climb Ben Nevis. On reaching the summit of Ben Nevis, Bissell erected this peace cairn, which he dedicated to a collective strive for world peace. Of course, standing atop the tallest mountain in the UK, the Peace Cairn is the highest war memorial in the country, but it's not the only one you'll find on top of a mountain. Bissell played a large part in encouraging others to construct peace cairns, and you'll now find them on mountains in countries all over the world, all thanks to Bert Bissell. Bissell was later given the freedom of both Fort William and of Dudley, and after he died in 1998, he was buried at Glen Nevis, not too far from here. Now, having looked around the parade, we're making our way onto Fort William's rather long high street, which very much serves as the heart of the modern town. Running for just under half a mile, the high street is lined with shops, pubs, and buildings from a number of different eras, the most impressive of which is probably the soaring St Andrew's Church. Situated just a few steps away from Duncansburgh MacIntosh Church, St Andrew's here was built in 1880, replacing an older chapel that had been built a number of decades earlier in 1817. That original chapel, though long since gone, was actually a rather significant landmark, as it was the first chapel belonging to the Scottish Episcopal Church to be constructed, as for a long time the Episcopal Church had become heavily repressed in Scotland. In the 18th century, the Scottish Episcopal Church came to be seen as sympathetic to the Jacobite rebellions in the eyes of the British government, which was seeking to crush revolts across Scotland. As such, after the uprisings ultimately failed after Culloden, the Episcopal Church found itself catching the ire of the British government, being suppressed until 1792. After that point, the way was paved for the chapel and later church building to be built here in Fort William, an important step in the development of greater religious liberty in Britain at the time. But as we pass by the town's Grand Bank, built back in 1911, we're now going to take a brief detour away from the high street. As we've mentioned, Fort William is a popular place with tourists for its proximity to Ben Nevis, as well as a number of other spectacular natural attractions, including Loch Linnhe and Glen. Given the thousands of tourists that come to Fort William each year, you'll find a number of hotels in the town, like the Imperial Hotel here just off the high street, which has been in operation since 1900, although it's housed within a building that dates all the way back to 1750. With over 120 years of greeting visitors under its belt, the Imperial begs the question, just how long have tourists been coming to Fort William? Well, for much of the town's existence, it was a military place first and foremost, with major army activities taking place well into the 20th century. But the first tourists to Fort William could be traced to as far back as 1771. Why that year? Well, 1771 was the year of the very first recorded ascent of Ben Nevis, achieved by a botanist from Edinburgh named James Robertson, who climbed the mountain in search of plant samples. At that time, however, Ben Nevis didn't quite have the nationwide notoriety that it does today. Though of course known by the people who climbed it for its height, it wasn't until 1847 that Ben Nevis was confirmed as the UK's tallest mountain, a story which made headlines around the country. As a result, Ben Nevis soon became the ultimate prize for British mountaineers, and people have been climbing it in their thousands ever since. But what exactly is it like to climb Ben Nevis? Is it dangerous? And how long would it take you in the 21st century? Well, we'll answer all of those questions and more about the famous mountain in a moment. But we now find ourselves approaching the delightful Cameron Square. Located at the heart of Fort William, Cameron Square here was significantly modernised in the 2010s, and it's today home to a delightful array of landmarks that tell the story of this town. The most recent addition to this sleek square is the building in front of us, the Highland Cinema, an independent picture house that opened in 2020, housed in a particularly cosy building that makes a modern twist on the traditional Highland dwelling known as a bothy. Next door to the town's central cinema, meanwhile, we find Cameron Square's oldest landmark, the West Highland Museum, which was established back in 1922. Complete with history on Fort William as well as the wider West Highland region, the museum is a must-visit when you're in town here, as it features exhibitions on the legacy of the Jacobite risings, which began not too far from here in Glen in 1745, as well as the illustrious folklore of the Highlands, bagpipes, the Gaelic language, and much more. Much like the bothy-style cinema on Cameron Square, the West Highland Museum is another cosy landmark of the town centre that endears locals and visitors alike. But just a few steps away, there's an interesting spot that tells us about one of history's most unusual ascents of Ben Nevis. On the 9th of May 1911, Henry Alexander of Edinburgh decided to take on Ben Nevis as had never been done before. That day, he left from here on Cameron Square in a Model T Ford, setting out for what was dubbed as one of the most daring feats in motoring's then short history. He successfully reached the summit, and 9 days after he set out from this point of Fort William, he returned triumphantly to Cameron Square, where he was greeted with wild celebrations by the townspeople. The statue that stands on Cameron Square today, meanwhile, was placed here in 2018, and it's modelled on a Model T Ford at Ben Nevis's summit. That's because to celebrate the centenary of Alexander's feat in 2011, a group of hikers actually assembled a whole Model T Ford at the summit, in the middle of a major snowstorm. The weather at the top of Ben Nevis can be fierce, and we'll talk more about it in a moment. But across from Cameron Square here we find the Volunteer Arms, one of the oldest pubs in Fort William. The Volunteer Arms dates back to the 1870s, and it takes its name from the Cameron Volunteers, a troop of 645 men who were brought together here in 1793. Members of Clan Cameron, the volunteers raised here were later deployed in military campaigns all over the world, and they became the 79th Regiment of the British Army, also known as the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. One of the Army's longest operating regiments, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders served for 168 years, from 1793 until 1961, and you'll find numerous monuments and memorials to them all over Scotland, including the famous Soldier at the Station statue in the centre of Inverness. Hailing from the Highlands and the area around Fort William, the volunteers were more than well equipped to deal with climates of any sort. And that brings us back to the weather in this part of the world. As you can tell from this wet and grey morning, Fort William isn't exactly the Costa del Sol. In fact, located on Scotland's craggy west coast, Fort William is often called the rainiest town in Scotland, seeing an average of 212 days of rainfall each year. Fort William is so rainy, in fact, that it sees more than double the average rainfall you'd get in Edinburgh, which has 129 rainy days each year, although there's a very good reason for this. The huge mountains around Fort William are located especially close to the coast, and so this area acts as a bit of a rain shield for the rest of Scotland. Of course, the issue with protecting the rest of the country is that all the rain that comes barreling in from the Atlantic Ocean gets dumped on Fort William, and that's why it's important to remember to bring a raincoat if you're visiting the town, and to be well prepared if you're planning on scaling Ben Nevis. The drizzle in the town centre may be fairly constant, But the conditions up on Ben Nevis can be brutal right through the year, and you can even see snow on its summit even at the height of summer. So a walk up to the top of the mountain can't be done in a t-shirt and flip-flops, even in July. And as we embark on our own climb up this slope, the ascent of Ben Nevis takes around 8 hours if you follow the pony track. Now the pony track is often called the tourist route, but even so, it's a tough climb that requires good fitness, preparedness, and stamina to make it all the way to the top, and then all the way back down again. Approaching the top of this steep slope, meanwhile, we're passing by the old MacIntosh Memorial church, built in 1890, looming over the high street. The church closed for worship in 2007, but it's now home to a rock climbing centre, which I'd say is rather fitting for this town. And having now made our way up from the Lochside High Street, we've strayed into the very hilly residential area of Fort William. Much of the town's 10,000 strong population is concentrated here and along the River Nevis to the northwest of the High Street. All put together, the marvellous Highland landscape surrounding Fort William has become the town's lifeblood in so many ways, starring as the main attraction for the thousands of visitors who visit here each year. Loch Linnhe is also fed by the River Lochie, which contains water that flows all the way along the Great Glen from Loch Linnhe. But from here at the top of the hill, we can find some magnificent views over the town centre and across Loch Linnhe. And sadly, it's where we'll end our walk around Fort William today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to visiting Fort William for yourself in future too.